welcome to Abstracts. This week, Human Experimentation Part 2.
Thousands of government-sponsored experiments did take place at hospitals, universities, and military bases around our nation. Scientists injected plutonium into 18 patients without their knowledge. Doctors exposed indigent cancer patients to excessive doses of radiation, a treatment from which it is virtually impossible that they could ever benefit. Informed consent means your doctor tells you the risk of the treatment you are about to undergo. In too many cases, informed consent was withheld.
Documents pried loose in 1979 showed that through a front organization, the Central Intelligence Agency funded what was called the MK Ultra Project.
My father was a 49-year-old Montreal businessman. He was someone who became anxious and was put to sleep for approximately 2 months, given shock treatments of various kinds, gradually building intensity to an intensity and a frequency that was not certainly the routine or standard at the time. He was given a whole slew of drugs, including amphetamines, insulin comas, barbiturates of all kinds, LSD. He was then forced to listen to recorded messages.
Hello everybody and welcome back to part 2 of our Human Experimentation series on Abstracts. We're laughing because we're drunk. That's pretty much
this is a part 2. We are suitably liquored up.
Absolutely, but you need to be when you're talking about the kind of things we have been talking about. If you tuned into episode 1, then you'll be quite familiar with what we've been talking about. Ideally, it would be great if you did listen to part 1 before this one, part 2, just to give you a ground in what we were talking about. It's not essential because what we're talking about is compartmentalized and we are talking about general little bits, but it'll give you a very nice overview of where we got up to before we got to this one. We covered Japan, we covered the Nazis, we covered early 1920s mentalists, I will say. And now we are coming into... Oh, actually, before we talk about what we're coming into, we're on the same gin. We're finishing off the Lone Wolf.
I'm afraid we are.
Yeah,
although, so, you know, we're not going to do it all again. Listen to number 1, but it's Lone Wolf Cloudy Lemon Gin, but we've added some lime now. So
we have whacked some lime in it. That's
yeah,
very nice.
It's quite good.
Yeah.
But I am very much the way there at the moment. Yeah. I'll try and hold this together. Go on, keep drinking. So yeah, in this half we're going to talk about the US and what they got up to. So like Andy said, Nazis, Japanese in the first half. In this half we're going to talk about the US and what they were getting up to in terms of bioethical violations, human experimental abuses, and the like.
You see, this is very difficult because just going back before we started recording, I read this once when I was researching a script I was writing. I read this great quote by I think it was William Godwin. And I think William Godwin was the father of Mary Shelley, if I'm not mistaken.
Was
of
he?
Frankenstein fame, yeah.
Okay.
But he has this great quote, and he says that it is an old observation that the history of mankind is little else than a record of crimes. And I think that's why these 2-part episodes were very, very difficult to research, because that's almost all of human history. You know, is people perpetrating crimes against each other. Like we said, there will be parts that are grim. The last episode was grim in parts. This episode will also be grim in parts. But everyone was at it, not just the Japanese, the Germans, but also the Americans.
Absolutely.
And also the British, and also the Canadians, as we will find out.
Yes.
All over.
Yeah. So, I mean, you know, a good place to start is there's a few really famous cases in the US, but one of the ones that really shocked me was the Jewish chronic disease hospital case.
I've never heard of this.
No, I mean, basically it's a guy who took immortal cancer cells and injected it into patients who weren't really aware of what was going on. So this guy, Chester Southam, he performed numerous studies on over 300 cancer patients at Memorial Hospital and on hundreds of healthy prison volunteers. Now, the prison volunteers were told that it was informed consent, but you had 2 groups, right? So Chester Southam is injecting cancer into the skin of these 2 groups just to basically find out what the immune response is.
Okay,
to make sure people reject
what your
it
body's
and
going to do.
what
How
your
you're
body's
going to yeah.
Exactly. And, he found essentially that there was a delay. So he found the immune systems took differing lengths of time to reject the cells. And that's between two groups. The healthy volunteers, that was 4 to 6 weeks, and the cancer patients, which was 12 weeks or more. And his gap in his data was it due to the cancer, or was it because, those he was studying were generally older, frailer, and chronically ill in the cancer patients? Mm-hmm. Was that why it was 12 weeks or more? So he repeated the study on non-cancerous but elderly and debilitated patients, just basically to find out whether it was the cancer or whether it was the frailty. And he did hypothesize that they'd reject the cells as quickly as healthy volunteers. It's a hypothesis. We should always remember that
A hypothesis, guys, is not a theory.
It's a potential theory.
It's a potential theory.
It's a maybe. This guy, he said based on 600 trials in his experience, this would be totally safe. Totally safe. Now I'll come on to why we know that's not the case in a minute, but it should be of no surprise that, let me read the undergraduate dissertation title and the master's thesis title of this man to you, and you'll understand exactly why this guy was doing what he was doing.
Okay, so first, his degree.
His undergraduate dissertation title.
Undergraduate dissertation.
A study on the saprogenicity and factors influencing decay of certain brown rot fungi on western red cedar heartwood test blocks. So, wood. Master's thesis in 43, effects of extract on western red cedar heartwood on certain wood decaying fungi in culture. So he's basically observing the dose-responsive growth rates of fungi in dilutions of red cedar extract, essentially.
Okay, yeah, cool.
But yeah, he was basically working for the forestry department in his university. This was a man who dealt with trees, or if you listen to part 1, logs. So the study that he then did at the hospital was. What, you see where this is going, don't you?
Carry on. Sorry.
Yeah, so the study was funded. It was funded by high-profile institutions. It was funded by the American Cancer Society and the U.S. Public Health Service, and 22 patients were provided by the director of the Department of Medicine at the hospital, Emmanuel Mandel.
Mr. Mandel, human trafficking.
Mr. Mandel providing patients. So
logs. No, they're not patients, man. They're trees.
No, and actually you'll like this. Southam, the guy who dealt in trees, informed Mandel, the director of the hospital, that consent wasn't needed because these sorts of studies had become routine, he said. Routine. So that's a good enough reason not to get consent. He also said they don't need to be informed that the injections carried live cultured cancer cells. HeLa cells, as they're called, because HeLa is short for Henrietta Lacks, who died of an immortal cancer tumour. So this thing, basically, they're immortal cancer cells.
Yeah. Let's just clear up what immortal cancer cells actually are.
If you suspend it in essentially a vitamin and nutrient-dense fluid, because it does still need to be fed. It's not, it's not.
It needs to be cultured.
It's not defying thermodynamics, energy in, energy out. It needs to be fed, but it doesn't die of old age. There's no telomere problems associated with old age.
So presumably, as long as you just keep feeding it, it's going to just stay alive.
It's going to carry
the
on.
culture's going to, yeah.
So there's this, if you look at the immortal, I think it's called The Immortal Life of Henrietta Lacks, this tumour survived for a very long time. It might even still be about, but this tumour was used for its for these cells. So people would get hold of these cells, and this guy Southam decided he was going to inject these immortal cancer cells into the skin of these patients who didn't need to be informed, because he said it was of no consequence to them.
Because they're trees.
Precisely. Trees never answered back.
They're
so
redwood trees. They can't sign a disclaimer, or
Exactly.
They can't sign anything.
Imagine that. You can imagine.
Just growing fungus on some trees, guys.
It's horrific. It's horrific. And actually, if you do research in universities, you'll know that there are basically ethical procedures and ethical documentation that you have to fill out. This guy probably. What sort of ethical considerations do you have to make for trees? This guy probably doesn't have a lot of experience in dealing with trees. Ethical considerations because of that. But I don't know. All pure speculation. But he said it was of no consequence to them. They had cancer injected into their skin, and they were told instead the injections were to test their immune capacity, which I guess was true, but they didn't quite really know what was going on.
Well, they just weren't bothered. They were like, okay, yeah, how strong can my immune system be?
Yeah.
Yeah, I'm definitely interested. Just inject me with that, mister.
Yeah,
Please.
yeah. You're just testing it.
Yeah.
Not that you're giving me cancer. They were told that a lump would form, or a nodule, at the site of the injection, but it would disappear. There was no mention that it was research. Luckily for Southam, no one died at least as a result of his research. But he was saying there was no risk. He'd done it 600 times. Nothing had ever happened. But in one case, the cancer cells had travelled 10 inches up the arm of the patient to a nearby lymph node. Obviously, once it gets into the lymphatic system, it's quickly shuttled throughout the body.
Very much.
And you have cancer in all sorts of places. Mm-hmm. The patient died of other causes shortly afterwards, but there was speculation that if he'd have lived, he would have been killed by this dissemination of the cancer cells. But
into the lymph nodes, yeah.
Luckily for Southam, the guy died before that happened. But so this was later basically put before an ethics board, or it was put before the New York State Board of Regents, it's called, and Southam genuinely said, there's a quote, he goes, "Let's face it." And he then turns around and says there might be a small risk that he wasn't willing to expose himself to, because they asked him, why wouldn't you do it to yourself? If it's not risky at all, would you inject yourself with this? He said
scientists
no.
do that all the time.
Well, they especially
always do it. Yeah,
It was huge. It was huge in the scientific community in the past.
Just self-administer, and they do all sorts of stuff.
Or, unfortunately, they do it to their kids as well.
Yeah, right.
I mean, imagine having a scientific dad, or mother. Well, in the past, they were a scientific dad.
Like much of our psychology professors, I'm convinced that they only have children to test on them.
Yeah. Just giving really bad lectures just to see how their undergrads. I'm joking.
Joking is
joking.
They don't test on their kids. They're great parents and lovely
people.
Give
great lectures.
Yeah, great lectures.
But yeah, I mean, he and Mandel. So Southam and Mandel were eventually exposed and found guilty of fraud and unprofessional conduct, because let's face it, they shouldn't have been injecting live cancer into people. But they were suspended for a year. Well, they weren't even suspended. So they were given a suspension, and then they said, actually, we'll almost like a suspended sentence. There's a suspension waiting for you if you don't stay out of trouble. So they basically got off without any punishment.
Trouble a little bit.
They stayed out of trouble a little bit. That's in 1965. In 1965, he was given that verdict. In 1968, Southam was elected the president of the American Association for Cancer Research. It's ludicrous, isn't it?
Oh my god!
Yep, you can find it on their website. I mean, everything we're about to talk about, including this, is going to sound like conspiracy, right? I mean, MK Ultra, you're going to talk about later on.
Oh yeah,
there is some conspiracy stuff in there, but especially the stuff I'm going to talk about, it ain't conspiracy. It's been declassified. It's been exposed. It's been testified to by the people who did it. He was elected to the president as president of the American Association for Cancer Research. He was injecting immortal cancer cells into the skin of people, and he said it will be fine, even though someone nearly died as a result of it. Now,
why would you be injecting cancer cells into someone if you thought it would be fine? Why do it at all?
So this is the point you made in the break, right? So between these two episodes, you said, why? Why would you do it if you already know? You sort of briefly recapped a thing about putting people's fingers into ice cold water from the first episode. Why? You know
that that's going to happen.
Yeah.
You know if you stuck your own finger in ice cold water for like 10 seconds, you'd want to bring it out. So
exactly.
You know that this is going to happen.
It's almost like there's a teleology of research. What's the purpose, in other words, of the research? There needs to be a purpose. And actually, it's interesting because when you write research papers, there is a section. It's what's the purpose of the study? Along with the hypothesis, what's the purpose? And actually, I think sometimes you don't really talk about the purpose of the research in a way that relates to this. What is the purpose to humanity? That doesn't necessarily get spoken about. What's the purpose to humanity of this study? For Chester Southam, it was a gap in his data. A gap, not a consequential gap. I mean, actually, you could say, well, he did put the nail in the coffin on the answer to the question as to whether it's to do with frailty or the cancer that lowers the immune system. But good God, there must have been another way. And if it had taken you 20 more years to do it in a more controlled and safer fashion, why the hell wouldn't you have done it? Because let's be honest, if you're treating people clinically, you could have taken the more conservative opinion.
But it's like we said in the last episode, these people aren't scientists, they're executioners. And they're playing around with whatever they want to play with. Mm-hmm. They view themselves as almost above.
Yeah, and they treat people like logs, like Southern did. So, I mean, that's one of them, and it's actually going to get worse. So, you may or may not have heard of the Tuskegee syphilis experiment.
I did briefly peruse over it, but I knew that you were going to be covering it for the episode, so I didn't look too deeply into it. But I know it's about... is it a spoiler if I say it? No, it's not so much. I know it's about syphilis.
No, it's not a spoiler.
But if you... If there was an element of you that thought there would be an element of glamour to syphilis, like my mate Dave does,
well, nowadays maybe with antibiotics,
prepare to have those myths dispelled, man, because there's nothing glamorous about it.
No. So this gets pretty dark. I mean, if we're ever going to give a trigger warning, this is it.
If you want to grab your own gin right now, I really recommend it.
Or just switch off the episode.
Yeah, like, it is grim. It's grim.
It's going to
grim,
get bad.
guys.
Because I'm going to explain to you what happens if you don't treat syphilis and why people didn't get treatment. So basically, from 1932 to 1972, so 40 years, the US Public Health Service, aided and abetted by a number of different partners, they basically conducted a non-therapeutic study. And it was on 400 black men in Macon County, Alabama, in and around Tuskegee. So it's an area, that's a county.
Where was this
in
done?
America.
Was this done in prisons, or was it done in hospitals, or was it, like, how was it
This
done?
was done on normal people. This was done on the everyday person. Yeah, not a prisoner this time. We've seen a lot of studies being done on prisoners.
That makes it any better, it's...
No, but then often even then the prisoners are told, if you volunteer, then you'll, etc., etc.
Reduce sentence.
Yeah.
This kind of bullshit.
Yeah.
God.
But,
right.
so anyway, so what would happen is the doctors would withhold syphilis diagnoses instead of telling the subjects they had syphilis, they'd tell them they had bad blood, which at the time in the black community was just like a catch-all term for generic illness. They had bad blood. So they'd tell them, they'd use that term, and they'd told them that. And in essence, this was a 40-year death watch. Because what they were doing, they were only selecting men for this study who were in the advanced or the third or tertiary stage of syphilis. So this is not somebody who's in the first or second stage or who had syphilis that went dark. This is somebody in advanced stages of syphilis, and they were left untreated. They were just given periodic blood tests and autopsies just to make sure they supplemented the data accurately. But, the fact that only the serious cases were selected shows that the researchers were only interested in seeing the serious complications. So if you want to give, the benefit of the doubt to these people, you shouldn't, because they wanted to see what happens when you don't give treatment in the most advanced stages of syphilis. Now, the horrible irony of all of this is the reason they were doing this, the reason they were withholding syphilis treatment from 400 black Americans, was they wanted to appropriate funds for syphilis control work or syphilis control programs among rural African Americans in the southern states. At the time, there was this widespread belief that syphilis wasn't as damaging for African American communities as it was for white communities. And the Public Health Service knew this wasn't true, but they didn't have the money. The Public Health Service didn't have the money or the budget to treat them. And so by withholding treatment from these 400 African American men in Tuskegee, they hoped to document the ravaging of the body by syphilis, untreated syphilis, thereby basically securing treatment for thousands in the southern states. So the horrible irony is they wanted to do this to help black men or help black communities.
Did people just not believe that syphilis was that serious?
No, only for white people. So that's the inherent racism.
Right.
That's the inherent racism in all of this.
It was only serious for white people, not for black guys.
And there was also this horrible racist notion that the black community was more sexually promiscuous, and therefore a lot of the doctors at the time basically said, well, I don't want to get involved, I don't want to help them, I don't want to treat them, because they're just going to go and have more sex anyway. So the Public Health Service knew this basically to be a bias. They knew this to be discrimination. They knew this to be purely just racist stereotyping. And they wanted to secure more funding. And they needed evidence that syphilis was a terrible thing. And what happened was awful. You know, they were documenting the ravaging of the body of 400 men. And it's a little bit like that, that thought experiment in philosophy, where they say, would the utilitarian thought experiment, where if you go into a doctor's GP office and you have perfectly healthy organs and there's 2 or 3 people there who have, defective organs, but they could be transplanted with yours, is it worth killing the one person, or killing you? So let's say you kill the one person, take all their healthy organs and transplant them into 2 or 3 different people in order to save their lives. It's purely utilitarian. And obviously everyone goes, I do not want to live in a world like that. That's not a world in which human flourishing takes place. That thought experiment is exactly the same thing. If they'd have taken a moment to say, hold on, are we just taking the organs from one healthy person and giving them to 3 people with unhealthy organs? Yes, that's what we're doing. We're killing 400 African American men in order to help other people. It's obvious in the first case that we don't want to live in a world like that, but despite that, the Public Health Service thought this was going to be a good idea, so they went ahead with it. Ironically as well, they wanted it to be a follow-up to the Oslo study, so all the good intentions initially were there. They were trying to combat racism because there was basically an Oslo study that happened in the late 1890s, which was exactly the same thing that I'm going to tell you about, but it was on white people. So they had data on white people and syphilis, which is probably why they thought it was so terrible for them. But they didn't have it for the black community. So they were basically saying, well, should we get this data for the black community, help black community, make sure that we don't have this systematic, institutionalized racist imbalance. So good initial starting point, but goes terribly wrong. They're withholding treatment. And so what is syphilis? For anyone who doesn't know what syphilis is, it's a highly contagious disease.
You get it from being a Casanova, don't you?
Yeah, well, you might have done. I was never lucky enough. So
no, sorry, bad joke.
No. I mean, to some degree, yes. So it's called, it's a virus or a bacterium called Treponema pallidum. Basically, it's a microscopic snake. Essentially, it looks like a snake. They're called spirochetes. So spirochetes can either be flat like a snake or they can be like a corkscrew. Really, really
Ooh,
good.
Like windy.
Yeah, like windy. They're really, really good at getting into things, at penetrating surfaces, membranes.
There's another illness that looks windy as well. I can't remember what it is.
It's a common bacterium. It's about spirochetes. There's lots of things that are called spirochetes. They're shaped like that.
Sorry, that's my bad. So the spirochete is just the shape of the actual.
It's just the shape
cell.
of it.
Yeah,
it's the shape of the bacteria.
The bacteria. Yeah,
there's a few things like that, and syphilis is an example of a spirochete. So I'm going to talk about spirochetes. They're basically corkscrews, or in syphilis's case, it's like a snake. It's like flat, wiggling through all of your membranes and getting into all sorts of parts of your body. It just permeates your body really easily. Gets into your lymph nodes very quickly. But it can be acquired or congenital. So acquired, it can either get in through your skin or mucous membranes, usually during sex, hence the Casanova comments. But then, even kissing will suffice. They get into your lymph capillaries, the really small parts of your lymphatic system that work their way through your entire body. They rapidly multiply and they get into your bloodstream, and suddenly you are syphilitic in your entirety. It's in your blood, and your blood goes everywhere. Or it's congenital, so it can also go through the placental barrier as well. So if you've got a kid and you've got syphilis, that kid's going to get syphilis as well.
Syphilis, yeah.
And you can be born with syphilis, and it's pretty horrible. I'll come on to that in a minute. But there's 3 stages. There's the primary stage, the secondary stage, and the tertiary stage. The primary stage, 10 to 60 days. It's basically an incubation period. You get your little lesion, you get your canker. You get your little ulcer either on your penis or in your mouth, or around your vagina. It's basically the first contact point. You're going to get this canker, this ulcer. It's usually not that uncomfortable, usually clears up, might leave a scar. Second stage, 6 weeks to 6 months. Rashes, painful bones and joints, circulatory problems like heart palpitations, fever, indigestion, headaches, moist ulcers that are teeming with these spirochetes, really bad if it's in your mouth because you've got this moist environment, hot, warm, really painful.
Perfect for bacteria.
Yeah, exactly. Patchy hair loss, so you look a bit moth-eaten. And it can disappear like that. So, like by magic, it'll disappear. And these patients, or people that had syphilis, they won't associate later on that, they've had achy joints or eye problems or chest issues. They won't associate that with the syphilis of the past that just went away. It's the same thing. Goes dark, goes underground. And when these people die and you perform an autopsy, you'll see that there's essentially loads of lesions over their organs. In many, many cases, people will be killed, or it will help in their life, the syphilis. So if you have secondary syphilis and it goes dark, you better get down to the doctors. It didn't go away. It's in you and it's working on you. So that's the secondary syphilis. However, that's not late stage. That's not advanced. And advanced is what the researchers in this Tuskegee study are interested in. They're interested in the late stage where you get these gummy tumours that appear. They destroy vital structures of your organs. Right, so they usually come together on your skin and they'll form this large crusty ulcer
over the epidermis, just trying to get it.
Yeah, the crust is over all this exuded bodily fluid, all this pus, all this matter that's kind of exuding out of your body. So you get these huge ulcers. Tumours really is what they are. Bone structures start to deteriorate, and where these tumours are on the bone, sometimes the bone can absorb it, and you'll get this kind of like the area where the bone kind of indents and disappears. But it can kind of survive that, or sometimes the bone can be totally destroyed by them. And actually, if anyone's interested, and I actually had to shut down my laptop and take a moment. This is when I thought I had food poisoning, because I was so fucking ill as a result of this. If you Google congenital syphilis, because this is when you see it really clearly, in congenital syphilis, where the fetus has it, it really effectively, obviously, destroys many bone structures. Usually, it's the palate and the nasal bones, and you basically get the front of people's faces totally destroyed by syphilis. So if you look at acquired syphilis, you can look at old photos where it was very prevalent at the time. Hence why these studies were important. Not these studies, but syphilis studies were important. People have noses missing.
This is when they're born. This is just like postnatal.
This can be acquired as well.
Development.
You can lose your nose. I mean, it destroys your bones.
For the congenital ones is what I'm talking about.
I mean, we're talking severe.
As soon as they're born.
Yeah, severe. I mean, there's no upper lip. There's no. And we're not talking cleft palates here. We're talking there's a hole in the middle of your face, a hole. The liver starts to become scarred and deformed. It can often impede the circulation of the intestines. The tumours start to attack the walls of the heart. This is a really horrible one. So it can start to affect, especially if it affects the aorta, it can cause that artery to dilate and the valves stop closing properly, which causes a leaky heart. And then you get this, essentially an aneurysm, like a balloon that forms in your aorta. And when that bursts, you suddenly die. And then even worse, neurosyphilis of the brain, of course. So the spirochetes get into the brain. It can cause general brain softening. It can lead to paralysis and insanity. It can cause stumbling, like flat-footedness.
Yeah.
Like I think they call it a flap gait, where your feet don't properly lift off the floor. You get blindness. It can also affect the other cranial nerves. You can become deaf. It's no joke. It
sounds like a nightmare.
It's a nightmare. We're not talking about it stinging when you go to the toilet. We're not talking about just standard STDs as we know them today.
It's an entire body disease that eats everywhere.
It destroys people. Destroys people in the most painful way imaginable. And that's what these people were looking for, these researchers. That's what they went out to find. So Wenger and von der Leer, they're the doctors. In 1932 they started this, right? So Oscar Wenger.
Wenger and von der Leer.
Yeah, I mean, it's
football manager.
Well, it sounds like they're straight out of Nazi Germany, doesn't it? Oscar Wenger and Raymond von der Leyen, they basically went in and just briefed all the state officials. They briefed the administrators and the medical officers and the local doctors, got them all on side. They let them know what was going on. They hired a black nurse, obviously, Eunice Rivers, to help out because she was really important in making sure that they trusted the doctors. They just then went.
It was like pulling out your token Tory in a way, isn't it?
Yeah,
it's
or the
like,
Fox News.
Or the Fox News.
Yeah, they get the one black racist on Fox News. Well, they had Eunice Rivers to help them out because they trusted Eunice, right? They then went around the region, testing the local population, basically fishing. Great big net, found 400 men, they identified them, told them they had bad blood, gave them some pink aspirin tablets, and of course, at that time, we're talking, people that didn't have access to education, and people that didn't have access to medical care. They hadn't had aspirin before. So when they gave them these pink tablets, they didn't tell them they were aspirin. They said it was for their bad blood, as I said earlier. They gave them these pink tablets, and the men were amazed. Their aches and pains went away. They felt great because they were on aspirin, right? And so that brought them a certain amount of trust. And they were also given an iron tonic later on, so they felt better.
It sounds like a chemical equivalent to what the exorcists were doing back in the day. It's like people associate them with being educated. They weren't educated themselves. They'd be suffering from some kind of condition, and then this person would come along and they'd just perform some kind of basic psychological thing on them that they think would work because they were bought into the old culture, the entire culture of it, and they thought it would work. And it's the same kind of thing. You're not educated. You don't know what you're doing. You hand yourself over and wow, this is a miracle. It's a miracle drug. It's a miracle thing.
Yeah, a miracle thing. These pink tablets. I feel great. I trust them. Whatever they're doing must be working.
Because I feel good.
I feel good. And the worst thing is as well, they were also given treatment to prevent them becoming infectious. So that was one of the things the higher-ups did say. They have to not be infectious. They were given some treatment. And because of the differential types of treatment, it essentially confounds the study because they were all given different treatments of some description just to stop them being infectious. And of course, now we know that has at least some effect on the syphilis in general. And so the results of the study are meaningless. 40 years. It was meant to last 6 months. It was meant to last 6 months.
What?
6 months to a year, 40 years. It was because initially...
How did they get away with it for so long?
Initially there was no funding, right? So after a year, the director of the Department of Venereal Diseases said, there's no funding, we have to stop this. However, von der Leyen got a promotion, the other guy retired, and he became the director and continued it. And it became a training program where everyone that was brought into this department in the PHS, the Public Health Service, it was like a venereal diseases division, everyone that was trained in it went into the Tuskegee study to basically learn diagnostic methods. Because that's what you're doing. You're constantly taking blood samples, you're diagnosing the syphilis, the stages of the syphilis, how bad it is. And everybody became normalized to it. And so there was this internal promotion within the PHS that meant that the directors and the people in charge of it were always, and even the panels and boards that overlooked it, were basically over time just full of people that were trained in the Tuskegee study. And they felt some level of, you work for a company, the company means nothing to you beforehand, then you go through it, and you feel unless something terrible happens to you there, you feel some level of attachment. People that work for example, Coke or Pepsi will eventually just only drink Coke or Pepsi at the dinner table. I don't work for them. It seems a bit weird to me, but that's kind of how it is. You feel a bond to it, and that's what happened with the Tuskegee study. So 40 years it went on for, and they got the autopsies just incidentally as well because they were basically bribing them with burial stipends. They were saying, they had another...
We'll look after you're gone, kind of way. Don't worry, your family's not going to worry about all the costs it's going to cost to bury you.
Yeah.
Is that what you mean?
Yeah. They had a charity that basically gave these burial stipends, these funds. And so you said, as long as we can perform an autopsy. Yeah. There we go. So that's how they got the autopsies.
We'll bury you so long as you let us cut you up. Yeah,
exactly. And initially you might say, look, okay, these guys, they had no medical care anyway. So to the sicker among anyone listening, you might say, well, what's the matter anyway? They were never going to get medical care.
Well, this is the thing. It's like, this is the United States, isn't it? There is
Yeah.
no health insurance.
Wow.
So it's not like here after the Second World War when we develop, we have the NHS and it suddenly everybody can get medical care, and it honestly is first do no harm. Like here in America, it's like, it's the same thing as saying, okay, work for us your entire life because we'll give you dental, health, medical, all this kind of stuff. I'll look after your family after you're gone. It's how gangsters used to like proposition people into doing hits for them.
It's blackmail.
It's complete blackmail. It's like, right, yeah, you come do this, shoot this guy in the head and sort out this kind of thing, and we'll make sure your family's all right.
They
Because
didn't
you're
even know
useless.
that's it.
You're going nowhere, mate. Everyone knows you're a waster.
The thing is, it's not even blackmail because they didn't even know what was being done to them. They didn't know they had syphilis. It was withheld from them. That diagnosis was withheld. They just had these pink tablets, told they had bad blood, they were being treated. They thought they were being looked after. Even a burial. Oh, by the way, can we do an autopsy? We'll give you some money. They felt quite looked after. And at the time, there was no medical. They couldn't have got medicine anyway. However, in 1937, they could have done. Because the Rosenwald Fund, which initially was when they were planning Tuskegee, the Rosenwald Fund was going to be funding them. But then the financial crisis, the Great Depression took place.
Yeah.
So they pulled out. Eventually, the Rosenwald Fund comes back in 1937 and says, let's renew some funding for syphilis control because it's a terrible thing and it's ravaging the world at the time. And actually, during the Second World War, it's really important because it was killing something like 300,000 people a year. It was taking out like the equivalent of 2 divisions, like two military divisions.
Okay.
So it was really important for the military effort. And they're obviously looking at the rest of the world, going, when you get this sorted out, everyone looks like they are race. It's like a race, an arms race. Everyone's on a total war footing. We're approaching a war. So it's really important to the Americans to get syphilis under control. And so William B. Perry of the Harvard School of Public Health was sent to Macon County, which is in Tuskegee, and von der Leyen essentially said, right, that's a threat. They might get treatment. So they assigned Nurse Rivers. Remember Nurse Rivers? Assigned Nurse Rivers to this William Perry. Got William Perry, who was a black physician, on board. So he was on board with it all. He was like, right, okay, we'll reject these 400 people. They won't get treatment. I understand.
Because it's under the guise of helping everyone, isn't it?
Yeah.
As well.
And so what would happen is they would turn up to the clinic, and Nurse Rivers knew by name and by sight who those people were, those subjects. And so she could deny them treatment. So Nurse Rivers was actively then denying treatment that would otherwise have been given to them. That's where it all changed. That's where these people could have been saved, and Nurse Rivers and William Perry were denying them treatment. Then in World War II, you had the draft. And so about 250 of the subjects were under 45, and they were drafted for the war. And they were actually in the, I think it was 1A. They were in like the category that's like first in line to go to the front. And they had their physical examinations, as everyone did, and they were then diagnosed with syphilis for the first time as far as they were concerned. And their local draft board started sending them letters saying they had to get treatment for syphilis, to their surprise. But the PHS, the Public Health Service, intervened and basically obtained deferments for them. They call them in documents soldiers of science, which just seems a bit sick, to be honest, because they're not even aware they're soldiers of anything. And the syphilis was said to be a mistake. That diagnosis was a mistake, blah, blah, blah. Don't worry about that. Also, you don't have to go to the war. I wonder why. So 250 of them were then denied treatment, even though they were diagnosed by the draft board with syphilis. Then, even worse, in 1943, the Henderson Act made it clearly and explicitly illegal. It was anyway, but it made it like really stringent and clear. It was illegal to withhold treatment. And even required, like the NHS, it actually required local health officials to go around the state and test everyone between 14 and 50 years old and provide treatment for free. But the local health officials agreed not to apply this to those 400 men.
Too socialist.
Yeah, and then after World War II, you've got penicillin, and that would have really helped. It would have really helped control and deal with syphilis, but the trial was continued. That didn't seem to rattle their cages, and they were denied the drug. And then there was the Nuremberg Code. We talked about the Nazis before. There was the Nuremberg trials. They tried people, put a few of them to death for crimes against humanity. That didn't seem to hit the conscience of any of the researchers again. And there's a point that's made. I mean, there's a certain amount of racism involved in this. From I spoke earlier on about the the idea that it affects white people worse than black people, and that's why they started out on it. And it's very difficult to say why Rivers and Perry, the two black clinicians, became involved, and did they?
We don't know their motivations,
No.
or were they
Or did
encouraged in some way?
Or did
to
they
be
feel
involved,
impelled?
Yeah, right.
Did they
Were
feel?
they really convinced that actually
Yeah.
somebody came along to them and said, like, look, we're going to be helping the community because it's been too much. Like, we see it in white people. We want to find out if we can help it in black people and kind
Yeah.
of get you on board. And
Yeah, it's before the civil rights movement. You know, they might have felt that they had to go along, even if they'd have found out halfway through. It was, pardon me, not the what they thought, not what they thought it was.
it literally reminds me, as you were talking, of, have you ever seen South Park Bigger, Longer and Uncut, the movie?
No.
Oh, well, there's a scene in it where they go to war with Canada.
Mm.
And the American military is all set out there, and the leader of the army is going like, okay, like 1st Battalion or whatever, you are Operation Get Behind the Darkies, right? And it's
Oh.
like the whole thing is like you've got a Battalion 5 or something, and they are all black. And they're like
Nice.
sellotaped to planes and things like that. And
Really?
yeah. And it's like they've got to like protect the white people. You're like, you are Operation Human Shield. That's what they call it in South Park, the movie.
Yeah.
Your Operation Human Shield, your Operation Get Behind the Darkies. And then Chef says, have you ever heard of the Emancipation Proclamation?
Okay.
Yeah. And the guy goes, no, I don't listen to hip-hop. And this feels exactly like that.
Yeah.
It feels like you're just testing. You have all these people showing up for some war that they want to go and like contribute to. They feel like they're contributing to it.
Yeah.
Oh, they drafted like to it like any other soldier, but actually they are just basically Operation Human Shield for this kind of for syphilis.
They're logs
They're
again.
logs.
They're
They're
logs.
just logs again.
They're being used. They're being used, and you know, one of the points that's made in one of the papers on this is that actually there might have been, of course, a race dynamic in there. There was also a huge class dynamic. So a lot of the oppression was from, you know, very well-educated people turning around and saying, well, they're uneducated and they wouldn't have got it anyway. They're poor, so, you know, we might as well work on them. There's a few quotes where they basically said that they were going to die anyway, they weren't going to get the help anyway, so we might as well have experimented on them. It's like, yeah, but you denied them treatment. You denied them treatment. And actually somebody did eventually pick up on this, and somebody had a conscience. It's Peter Buxton. So he considered it, in his words, a moral disaster, which is to put it nicely. And he campaigned against it internally. And the PHS did actually conduct a review. But like I said earlier, they did it at what's now the Centre for Disease Control. That's where they conducted it. And the problem was all the officials had been trained, or most of them had been trained in the study itself.
Yeah, right. So they'd gone to Tuskegee, they got involved. That's where they had all their training from.
Yep.
Yeah.
Yeah. And they're the people on the board that are making the decisions. And they decided to continue the study. They did, I mean, to their credit, they did debase it quite a lot, but they then said, we'll continue it, but we'll improve it scientifically. They also conceded that it would be good to gain informed consent, good, but later decided that the subjects were incapable of giving it due to their meagre educations. And then they went and found surrogate consent.
They were clever enough to be soldiers of science, though, weren't they?
Yeah, wow, yeah, you didn't have to do anything for that. It's terrible, really. Because there's no value on human life in and of itself. It was based on their education, almost. Oh, they're not educated enough, so we can't ask them if they want to be involved. Oh, this is too important to ask an uneducated person. This is their life. Is there no value in human life and their own value on their own life? No. I mean, not from their perspective.
It's a South Park joke.
It
That's
is.
why I brought it up. It's just a South Park joke.
Yeah. And so they then went to people that were like in a parental position in some sense. They went to the local health authorities and said, okay, these people are not clever enough. So can we experiment on them? Can we have your consent on their behalf? Yes. So that's what the US is up to. And Peter Buxton was like, right, I'm off. He quits, goes to law school. It's like a film, this. There should be a film on this. I don't know. I don't think there is a film on this. There should be. He goes to law school. He tries to recruit law professors. Like, while he's there, no one's interested. Because, I mean, imagine a professor's being told by a student, oh, by the way, you'd be like, yeah, okay, sure. Eventually, he tells somebody who works at this Edith, I can't even say the name. I'm so liquored up now. Edith Lederer. So basically, it's a friend who works for the Associated Press. And they were interested. They cared. They sent it to their superiors, who then essentially assigned some highly regarded up-and-comer, Jean Heller, who was based in Washington. That she kind of knew she knew the establishment. She understood how it worked. And that then led to this huge media firestorm. And the PHS study did eventually end, and a black attorney, Fred Gray, brought a class action lawsuit against them, but it was settled by the US government. But there was this huge media firestorm. When it was published, there was just multiple articles, and the media got involved, and it blew up. Because people realised, because it only takes common sense, it only takes somebody who's got sort of a vague ethical framework that goes, oh, we're not telling men in advanced stages of syphilis that they have syphilis. We're withholding treatment that's free and available, and we're watching them go through, to remind you, neurosyphilis, softening of the brain, destruction of the bones, cysts, we're talking ulcers, gummy tumours, scarred livers. I mean, it's horrific.
You can always trust a good journalist.
Yeah, and that's not all I got up to. So that's Tuskegee. But what the hell was the PHS getting up to overseas? Well, initially it wasn't overseas, so they had other stuff going on. So on October the 1st, 2010, Obama actually telephoned the president of Guatemala, and he apologized for the US government's research, essentially.
In Guatemala in 2010.
Thankfully not, but in 1946 to 48. So again, the same time. So at the same time that we are condemning, or the West is condemning the Nazis, this is the stuff that we're getting up to. So basically, they deliberately infected 5,000 people with STDs, which included, again, syphilis, because the PHS and the Venereal Diseases Division had this particular fixation on syphilis, but also gonorrhea, cancroid. They were infecting prisoners, soldiers from different parts of the army, patients in a psychiatric hospital, and they were using commercial sex workers as a means of doing this. And they were sort of performing all sorts of different things, like serological experiments, which is essentially where you sort of study the bodily fluids and immune reaction to pathogens that are introduced to it. But they were essentially, the reason they were looking at this is, so this study where they went to Guatemala, it started because they realised, or there was some idea, that when penicillin came out, if you had a shot of penicillin straight after being given syphilis, it would inoculate you. So essentially, it would vaccinate you against syphilis. So they'd heard that syphilis plus penicillin equals equals vaccination. So that's where it began, and they initially did this in an Indiana prison, rather. So they were giving them $100, and they were doing these experiments, and there was informed consent, but it was a failure ultimately. So the first part of the study was to see if they could efficiently give people gonorrhea, right? Because you can't really run a study on humans. It all sounds a bit weird. If you're going to run a study where you're giving people STDs, you need to initially be sure you can give them the STD effectively, and that was the first thing. And they just couldn't do it. This was led by this guy, Dr. John Mahoney, and they basically, he concluded his report, or he concluded in a report. He said efforts were made to produce experimental gonorrhea in these volunteers by almost every conceivable expedient, except for the intraurethral inoculation of pus taken directly from the cervix or urethra of infected females, or by the natural method of infection, sexual intercourse. So he basically says, look, we couldn't do it. We were giving people gonorrhea every which way we could possibly imagine, up the urethra, pus from the cervix, all sorts of things. We didn't try sex. That wasn't meant to be a next step statement. That wasn't... that wasn't meant to be we didn't try this, so...
Why don't we just try them having sex with each other?
Yeah. That wasn't meant to be... However, his assistant had other ideas. So, his assistant, Dr. Cutler, later went on essentially work for the Guatemalan army. He was trying to do inoculation tests or trying to inoculate and vaccinate the Guatemalan army because, like I said, syphilis was a huge problem in the army, and they were losing sort of divisions worth of people in the US and in Guatemala. So Cutler became really involved with these local authorities. He was conducting all sorts of serology experiments, again, like bodily fluids experiments on children, leprosy patients, psychiatric patients, and sometimes he and his collaborators were giving like malaria treatments. And so when you read the full report, there is some good with the bad, but the scales are definitely on the bad side. So the first follow-up to Mahoney's study, where Mahoney's saying, we didn't try sexual intercourse. Well, of course, let's try normal exposure, in scare quotes. Normal exposure, basically, they found a really reliable way of doing this, or a more reliable way. It wasn't the most reliable way. A more reliable way was to use a commercial sex worker. So they'd either already got an STD, whether it's syphilis or gonorrhea, or they were given it.
So they'd find a commercial sex worker, either with some STD,
or they'd give them an STD.
They'd give them an STD.
They'd sort of swab them with
and then what would they do?
Well, they were first ordered not to douche, and if anyone doesn't know what douche means, it's to wash themselves out. With
wash themselves out, right, yeah.
Yeah, they're not to wash themselves out or wash between sexual intercourse in a day, and they would be introduced to either a prison population or an army soldier population, and this commercial sex worker would be ordered to have intercourse with some number of men. Like, to give you an example, one sex worker had contact with 8 men in 71 minutes. So they were just going around having sex with the men, and they were finding this wasn't really working very well. There's these reports in the debriefing where they're saying that, I mean, some of the prisoners must have loved this. Because
so hang on a minute. Hang on a minute.
Yeah, okay.
Hang on a minute. Right, okay, so they get a professional sex worker, whether or not, and then this professional sex worker either has a sexually transmitted illness or they don't. And it's she. It's not a man. It's a she.
It's a she,
right?
Yep.
It's a she. She's either got a STI or she doesn't have an STI, right?
Yeah.
If she doesn't have an STI, then they give her an STI. If she does have an STI, then she's to sleep with or to have sex with X amount of prisoners. How many prisoners in 71 hours did you just say?
8.
8 prisoners in 71 hours.
71 minutes.
71 minutes. Okay, so she's to have sex with 8 prisoners, unprotected, unwashed, uncleaned, for 71 minutes.
It's just over an hour, yeah. So about 10 minutes each, just less. Which is quite good for them.
Was she paid for this at least?
Yeah. As far as I'm aware, she was paid for it. That's what it says.
I'm sorry, man.
In some cases, the prisoners, because they found... I said
this is the best prison on planet Earth.
Well, absolutely. And the thing is...
Well, so, hang on a minute. That's the gin speaking. It isn't the best prison on planet Earth. It's absolutely not anywhere that's even remotely good on planet Earth.
Well, no, I mean...
But to the prisoners who were in there...
At that point, it might have been. I mean, it becomes the worst place ever in a minute, and I'll tell you why. Initially, because I said a minute ago it was very effective. Well, it wasn't totally effective. It wasn't as effective as it could have been. I mean, sometimes it was like half the people got STDs and half didn't. And in some cases, they had essentially a brothel going on. They had they left some prisoners with a group of sex workers for the night, and they could have sex whenever they liked. And all the rest of it, they were just hoping that the more natural, the more normal the environment, the more sex they would have, and the more they would get syphilis and whatnot. The problem was Cutler. Cutler couldn't guarantee anybody had syphilis in the first place or gonorrhea in the first place because, they were struggling enough to give it to the men, let alone giving it to a commercial sex worker. Right? You hire a commercial sex worker. Well, I thought you couldn't necessarily 100% of the time guarantee you'd given it to the prisoners. Right? Because they were trying to give... Yeah, so how can you be sure you're giving it to the sex workers? So there's some fundamental design flaw in the first place. Right? So it gets a bit more sinister from there. Because initially you think, well, it's just having sex. Who's going to have a problem with that? Yeah, well, I mean, so then they started trying something else. They call it superficial and deep inoculation. So superficial was where they'd take some infected pus on some cotton wool and they'd dab it on the end of your penis. And you think, okay, that sounds a bit grim, but I can deal with that. Deep inoculation was they'd get cotton with the infected pus. They'd wrap it around a toothpick and it was inserted about half an inch into the urethra of the penis and carefully rubbed over the mucous membrane, so much as so to cause pain. Imagine having a toothpick.
All I've been to is a clinic, and they've done that once.
Well, they put a toothpick down.
Well, no. It's like it was.
Whoa.
I don't know whether they do it anymore, but they swabbed. There was a swab.
Oh, yeah.
They take a swab
okay.
of the inside of the urethra, very shallow.
Are you telling me you're a Casanova?
No, but that's certainly what they did to me. And
Avoided the question?
It was horrendous. It was one of the most horrendous experiences I've honestly ever had in my life.
Really?
Yeah. Oh God! What is someone sticking a?
I'm trying to imagine a gallstone, or like a kidney stone. Like,
well, I'm saying in my life, I've never had a gallstone. But like at that time, like I'd never experienced anything like it. It was horrible. Anyway, and that was that was for my health. This was for the purposes of my health. This wasn't like...
They weren't trying to give you an STD.
They weren't trying to give me anything. They were trying to find something. You know what I mean?
Well, some of the prisoners found a really good way of getting out of serving, essentially, in the army and getting some treatment, so getting some time off, was to give themselves syphilis. They basically learned from the researchers. And one effective way they found was taking a matchstick. And they would use a matchstick because, very, frictional. There's a lot of friction on a matchstick. Yeah, imagine. Can you? I mean, our audience is predominantly women, so they won't necessarily appreciate this. But for any men listening, you know how horrific.
Just the thought of it, even if you've never experienced it, thought of it.
I can make it worse. They would sometimes wait until they had ejaculated in the sex work, and then they'd go in afterwards. And they would try and basically double do it. So they'd go in, and while the penis was engorged, they'd then stick the toothpick down your face. Oh. Yeah, they'd wait until then, just to make sure.
These are terrible people. I'm sorry.
These are terrible people.
These are terrible, awful people.
Well, it gets even worse. They decided that wasn't good enough, so they moved on to scarification. They found there was an even more effective method of transmission. So actually Dr. Mahoney, the original guy, he was in correspondence via letters with Cutler, and Mahoney was like, this is not okay, you shouldn't be doing this. So at least one person realised that this was not okay. This is the guy that said we didn't try sexual intercourse, and he was very against this. Basically Cutler actually called this a heroic method. Cutler called this. They would pull back the foreskin, and on the top of the glans, or the head of the penis, they'd take a 20-gauge long bevel hypodermic needle, and they would use that to scratch an abrasion of about 2 to 5 millimeters. yeah, your face. And they tried not to draw blood or serum from it, but, invariably there would be bleeding, and then they'd take the infected cotton and dab it onto the newly abrased penis. Yeah. Yeah. And if that wasn't good enough, they then moved on to spinal fluid. So they did these cysternal punctures, so basically punctures just below the skull, in epileptic patients. And they had the audacity to say this might help the people with epilepsy because of the shock of being inoculated.
How?
I don't know.
How do they know?
They said the shock of being inoculated with syphilis might help them. Who knows? They said. So they basically took out spinal fluid and they put basically syphilis back in, like syphilisic fluid back in, all these spirochetes straight back in, right by the brainstem. I mean, it could have caused death.
Bullshit. Surely they know that epilepsy is caused by a focus at this point.
I mean, they must have
did
done.
Did they know that yet?
I think they did, but they said that the shock of it might be enough to help them. But it was right by the brainstem. Thankfully, the brainstem wasn't affected. However, unthankfully, the fact they put syphilis in to the spinal fluid caused neuroepilepsy in many of the cases. Like I said earlier, the softening of the brain. Insanity was the term used at the time, and people were just losing their minds because they were having syphilis injected into their spinal fluid. And one subject, for example, lost the use of their legs for 2 months. And let me just read to you a short case study. It's a couple of paragraphs on Bertha. Bertha was, so you might think, well, they're just being given syphilis. It's not that bad. If you've got a penis, you think it's terrible, the worst thing ever. But you might think, oh, okay, it's you were talking about the Nazis earlier. The Nazis were much worse than this in the last episode. Okay, just listen to this. Bertha was a female patient in the psychiatric hospital. Her age and the illness that brought her to the hospital are unknown. In February 1948, Bertha was injected in her left arm with syphilis. A month later, she developed scabies, an itchy skin condition. Mm-hmm. Several weeks later, Cutler noted that she'd also developed red bumps where she had injected her arm.
I have had
he had injected her arm.
by the way.
Have you?
Yeah, I got it from a flat. I used to live like down Bow Road.
From a flat?
From a flat. I got it from like, I moved into this flat down on Bow Road and I got scabies.
Really?
Yeah. It's not nice. It is not nice. I'll tell you that.
From a flat. I mean, look.
From a flat, from a couch.
If you're going to get it anyway, you don't want to get it from...
it was in a flat.
You want to get it in a Casanova. Like
it was in a flat in London after the year... When was it?
From a couch?
It was definitely the flat in some way gave me scabies, but I reckon it was the couch as well because the couch was in there for ages. It was just a hideous thing, but it is not a nice thing. And that was in, when would that have been? That would have been about like 8 years ago.
Wow.
So like it's not gone. It is in London. I think I ended up giving on a couple of my best mates because they crashed on my floor.
I'm terrified now. I had no idea that you could get it from a couch.
Oh, mate, I had scabies. It was all like it was all over me, man. And I went to the doctors. They were like, yeah, you've got scabies. And they gave me this bottle of stuff. And I'm like, what do you mean, scabies? They're like, yeah, you've got basically a bunch of like microscopic insects chewing away at you. So I'm like, all right. And they gave me this, it was just this ointment. And I had to rub it on my body in a body wash, like all the time. Until it kind of disappeared.
I mean, I might as well come out now as well. I've had it as well.
Yeah.
I did not get it from a couch.
Where did you get it? Never mind.
Never you mind where I got it from.
It's none of my business.
I actually know the person I got it from, and I got it from an intermediary in the process. So, but again, an ointment. You rub it over yourself. You kill the tiny mites that are under your skin. Yeah, it's not nice. Absolutely.
It's horrible.
It's horrible.
It's horrible. We can both personally attest to how horrible it is.
Yeah,
it's terrible.
You can't personally attest to what's coming next. Cutler noted she'd got red bumps where he had injected her arm, lesions on her arms and legs, and her skin was beginning to waste away from her body. Bertha was not treated for syphilis until 3 months after her injection. Soon after, on August 23rd, Cutler wrote that Bertha appeared as if she was going to die, but he didn't specify why. That same day, he put gonorrheal pus from another male subject into both of Bertha's eyes, as well as into her urethra and rectum. He also reinfected her with syphilis. Several days later, Bertha's eyes were filled with pus from the gonorrhea, and she was bleeding from her urethra. I honestly, I can't even say it. On August 27th, Bertha died. I mean, I can barely get through it without just losing it, and not because it's funny. It's honestly the most horrific thing I think I've ever read. I read all the Nazi stuff.
It's awful.
But when you say
it's awful.
He put gonorrheal pus into Bertha's eyes.
In her eyes,
she's a psychiatric patient. Okay, she's not okay. She's not well anyway, and he's putting it into her eyes. And it took. She had pus filling her eyes, and she died. Maybe because of the syphilis, maybe not. But she died in serious pain and stuff.
She died in a horrible way. A really horrendous, horrible way that she had no need to die from. She absolutely did not need to die that way.
And they had penicillin at the time. They had penicillin.
From years ago. They were using it in the field.
They were using it in the field. I mean, this was just after the Second World War, and they're not using it. And actually, the reason they're testing this is because they believed that penicillin, along with gonorrhea or syphilis rather, could essentially vaccinate people, but they didn't use it on Bertha.
Nazis saying like, okay, we need to come up with our new version of penicillin. If they could argue a situation where they'd never heard of this penicillin, but this is Americans. They
Well,
know about penicillin from Pasteur in France.
They were giving it to try and vaccinate people, but there were people like Bertha where they were just basically seeing
Just what had happened? What happens if I inject these eyeballs with some illness?
Yeah, let's put gonorrhea in her eyes.
Put gonorrhea in her eyes.
Because the original research was on rabbits and syphilis and penicillin. So that's where they got the initial thing from. Putting gonorrhea in her eyes. Gonorrhea in Bertha's eyes had nothing to do with the original hypothesis, which was that penicillin plus syphilis would vaccinate you.
Equals vaccination.
Yeah.
Not inoculation. It equals vaccination. Can we do that? Why? Why the eyes, man? Why just do it to her eyes?
I don't know.
Because you're
and
a
her
sick
rectum.
fuck.
And
That's
her
why.
rectum. Yeah, why is it every orifice? Why is it her eyes? Why is it her rectum?
Because you're a sick fuck.
Why?
That's why.
Yeah.
What's the name of this guy again? No, what's the name of the guy?
This guy, Dr. Cutler.
Cutler, you're a sick fuck, man.
Yeah.
You are a sick fuck.
Dr. John Cutler.
John Cutler, sick fuck.
It was later exposed. Obama apologised. But no reparations have been paid in any way. No medical assistance has been given. I think there has been some money, actually, that has been utilised for this now. But in general, there hasn't been a real reparation paid for this. Nothing's been done to make up for the fact that the US gave 5,000 Guatemalans syphilis against their will.
That is more Guatemalans than people that were tortured in Manchuria by the Japanese from 40 to 45.
Yeah,
3,000 were in Japan.
Having said that, in Manchuria, they then did, basically plague bomb whole villages,
Yes.
and there were a lot more. There was quite a lot of. I think there was about 30,000 plague deaths in Manchuria.
Yeah, okay, fair enough.
But I mean,
That's a
still,
lot.
I mean,
Yeah,
we sort of talk about how bad the Nazis were. In the last episode, we've gone in on the Nazis and the Russians and the Japanese, but we've got to remember that the US was also doing this. The good thing about the US is there's freedom of speech, and there's the freedom of the press, and you get whistleblowers, right? And they're protected under the Constitution, which is how the Tuskegee study was exposed.
Yeah.
Exactly. So it was, like you said earlier, a good old journalist was able to expose the study. It's not like you're in Russia where they're going to clamp down on you, or Nazi Germany, or modern day China or Japan. You can actually whistleblow. You're protected. There are laws in place, and you can go to the press. So although there are bad people everywhere, the institutions and the political systems, they are different.
Yeah.
They are different, and they're not perfect.
There's not a government-sanctioned suppression of the press.
Yeah.
You see, in Britain, in America, all these horrible things might be going on, but because of the way that the culture's made, because of the way society's built, equally, there is the equal opposite side. There's the equal and opposite reaction that is allowed. So you are allowed free journalists, free this, free that, and they're going to come and look for you. They're going to come and look for it because they're interested in it, and they're going to expose you, man.
Yeah, and that might be why we think
happens.
it's so bad in the West. That's why, one of the reasons we think it's so bad is probably because we can talk about it and we can expose it. But we've got to remember that they're not equal. And when we talk about, communist states and fascist or emperor-led states, it's very different to democratic, free states. So as bad as the US was,
you have to be much smarter in a Western society to cover this kind of stuff up, man.
Much more Machiavellian.
Absolutely, because people will find you out. You've got to. People are going to be looking for you.
And also, like I said, Peter Buxton, he was from the inside of the Public Health Service. He campaigned internally. They didn't do anything about it.
Went to the journalists, Associated Press.
He went and studied law, and then he went to the journalists, and he exposed them, and there was a media firestorm. So it's really important that we recognise the value of the press, especially now. There's a lot of talk about fake news these days. A lot of talk about journalists and the bad they can do, but we've also got to remember that they serve a vital role in a democratic society. Because it's not just about having someone who's protected and can say what they like and free speech. It's also about having the press that can follow it up and publish. And the internet's changed this slightly, so things can go viral, but being able to expose wrongdoing is vital to a democratic and a free and a fair society.
And this is why you should read multiple papers.
Yes.
You should not read one paper, because one paper is going to expose what they want to expose, and another paper is going to expose what they want to expose.
Yeah.
And you don't want to live in an echo chamber. You should be reading The Guardian along with The Telegraph, both of them. Because, there's problems on your side, just like there's problems on their side, This is the thing. But bringing up journalism is something very, very interesting, because on one side you have journalists exposing something, but then when we're coming into the 1950s in America as well, we've got journalists bringing to light certain thoughts, certain ideas to the fore. And one of the four things that, so this gin is getting one of the four things that doesn't even make sense. One of the ideas that some journalists would bring into prominence in the early 1950s and making people aware of was brainwashing. So people were really interested, journalists particularly, were really interested in brainwashing.
Well, this is similar to the whole telekinesis stuff and the telepathy. So there's the film The Men Who Stare at Goats. Right?
Yeah.
The idea that you could kill a goat from a distance just by looking at it.
Jedi mind trick them to death or whatever.
Yeah.
No, this is it. But so over the last two episodes in when we've been talking about human experimentation, one thing is we've really focused on the biological. We've focused on the physiological, like what do people inject people with, infecting people with illnesses, chopping off their limbs. Everything's very bodily. But one thing we haven't really looked at is the mind experimentation. And that really comes to the fore with this idea of brainwashing in the 1950s, which was pushed by journalists. And the reason this came to fruition is because of things like communism. You can wipe someone's mind, infiltrate someone's brain, make them behave in a certain way. And unfortunately, we are still in America. We're in America, we're in Canada when we're talking about these kind of experiments. And I'm going to bring up a thing called MK Ultra. Now, MK Ultra is super popular. A lot of people have heard about this. It's a very, 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 very popular topic. So I'm not going to go so in-depth with it, but what I am going to do is outline a few of the things that kind of happened through one particular kind of doctor. But what I'd like to do first is kind of talk about a little bit about brainwashing. So brainwashing, obviously, is brought to the front by a series of journalists, articles they've heard about it happening in Korea, mainly on prisoners of war in Korea, American prisoners of war.
And this is before we had North and South?
This is
before
so,
the...
This is exactly. So people people are kidnapped, prisoners of war, and then there's psychological experimentations done on these prisoners of war.
Okay.
And what this does is it raises this idea of puppet masters and the destruction of people's minds, which is scary. It's really scary because, we're going to talk about the 1950s in America. There's loads and loads of stuff. And they were very, very worried about mind control. Communists are going to come and take over your mind, and then all of a sudden you're going to become a robot.
Yeah.
All this kind of stuff. But really, what interested doctors, it wasn't so much that you could take someone over. Initially, what interested doctors and psychologists was this idea of curing a pathology. So, we chuck drugs at pathologies. If you're a schizophrenic, we'll throw drugs at you because we know now that some of these things don't work. But back in the day, the idea was that if you could deprogram someone in some way...
And when you say deprogram, you mean...
If you could de-pattern is another way of saying it. So
if you can unwind all of the neural pathways, all the connections...
So let's say, for example, you were diagnosed schizophrenic.
Yeah.
Right? And we all know... a lot of people listening to this know about electroshock therapies and things like this. So the idea of electroshock therapy is to deprogram someone. You just blitz the brain. You blitz the brain until it's just flatlined almost, right? The person's still alive, and it takes many, many months to recover. But the idea is that when you come back after all these months, is that the schizophrenia is deprogrammed. You should be normal again.
Okay.
But just we'll come on to that. I guess a little bit later. But yeah, obviously brainwashing does come to the prominence in the 1950s because of communism, because of Korea, because of this happening to POWs. But what kind of got the interest of the American government, and not just the American government, the Canadian government, the British government. In fact, this project wasn't always called MK Ultra. MK Ultra is the final name of the project. Previously, it was called Artichoke. And when it was called Artichoke, well, it got renamed from another name to Artichoke.
Asparagus, maybe.
Yeah, yeah. I think it was something like needless or something like this. Or like it was a strange word beginning with it, but it became Artichoke when Canada and Britain became involved because they were very interested in this, and about mind control, about brainwashing, about this kind of thing, and the reason for that was, if you're fighting communism, say for example you capture a Russian spy, right? You could ideally de-pattern them. You could hook them up to some electroshock therapy thing. You could de-pattern their mind altogether, input what you wanted to input, and then send them back to Russia as a double agent.
Wow.
Right? So this was kind of the idea. The aim was to achieve complete control over an individual. And the idea is to own them. So, for example, the head of MK Ultra was a guy called Sidney Gottlieb, and he was in charge for about 15 years. And this is a quote from Sidney Gottlieb as to the purposes of MK Ultra, and it was, quote, to investigate whether and how it was possible to modify an individual's behavior by covert means.
Wow. By covert means?
By covert means. Not by overt means, but by covert means. Could I do things to your psychology
without me realising?
to deprogram you in a certain way and build another way of viewing that you would be able to then go out and do our bidding? He says basically, he goes on to say that the goal was the controlling of an individual to the point whereby he will do our bidding against his will and even against such fundamental laws of nature as self-preservation.
Wow.
So he will do whatever we say, regardless of whether or not he might die in the process, or injure himself, or any of the biological imperatives for self-preservation that might avail. He will go against that by means of our brainwashing. And actually, in a declassified CIA document that was released in 1951, or it's a document from 1951, I don't know the exact date when it was released, this document states that we're now convinced that we can maintain a subject in a controlled state for a much longer period of time than we hitherto had believed possible. And they did this by playing on weaknesses, vulnerabilities, to turn people into a controlled source, in quotes.
This was interesting. You just said about vulnerabilities. Say that again, the bit about vulnerabilities.
So, we're now convinced that we can maintain a subject in a controlled state for a much longer period of time than we had hitherto believed possible. And then the person who's talking about the CIA document says this was by playing on weaknesses or vulnerabilities that people could be turned into controlled sources. So by playing on what you're vulnerable, your weaknesses, we can use that against you to change your brain to turn you into a controlled source whereby you will act as an agent on our behalf, what we want to do, regardless of the effects of your self-preservation.
It's interesting you say that because I mentioned in another episode the negotiation course.
Yeah.
Yeah. So this is crazy.
Yeah.
So this guy, evolutionary anthropologist, very well trained, did a master's at UCL, also entrepreneur, blah blah blah. Negotiation. So I was locked in a hotel, not locked, but in a hotel.
Is this your foot thing?
4
your
or 5
foot
days.
twitches and
Yeah. You know, the most honest part of your body, the feet, and all the rest of it. He'd film us, and he knew where we were going to, tell and knew where we were going to twitch before we did it. But one of the things he did on the first day, I won't say which course this is because it'll give it away, and it'll in the T's and C's. I'm not meant to talk about this. However, in this nameless negotiation course, on the first day, you are essentially belittled, abused. I mean, you're made to feel worthless by the negotiator or the consultant or the teacher, however you want to see them. And they kind of play this game where you are made into the child and they are the parent. But one of the things they do on the first day, I mean, it's incredible as well. I mean, just to be really clear, they're kind of sitting there at a table, sort of legs apart, staring at you into your soul, being extremely short. When you have dinner with them and you ask them what they do, for example, this guy turned around and went, "That's not relevant." And they make you feel like nothing. And they do go around at one point and ask you why you wanted to attend the course. And you say all sorts of things. And they make sure they get something emotional out of you. So, for example, one guy said, I want to see the bigger picture. I can't remember what I said, actually. But I remember this bigger picture one. Because what it was is the guy then wrote that down. And during a negotiation situation, or a role play later on, it was interesting. It was one where you bid on €1. And they make you bid more than €1 for €1. So you're there, you're in the corner, you're facing the corner, and you're competing against somebody else who's in the other corner of the room, facing the wall. And the guy who is in the middle, being the umpire, or it turns out they're the banker, so that's actually the person you should be competing with, but you don't realise at the time, is the negotiation consultant, and they whisper in your ear. So when you're bidding 99 cents... or you're only bidding up to €1, they whisper in your ear, I thought you wanted to see the bigger picture. They take the emotional thing you said earlier on, the thing that they take a vulnerability. They take something that really hits you in the heart, in the soul, and they whisper it into your ear. And they say, I thought you wanted to see the bigger picture. It was something like they said to me as well. I'm a bloody stubborn person, so I didn't bid more than €1 for €1. Thankfully, but apparently 99.9% of people do. People that aren't bloody stubborn, because they're whispering really emotional things into their ear, and it does become a method of mind control. So after the first day, they go, surprise. Actually, the whole thing was we were controlling you, and they can make CEOs bid more than €1 for €1, and they do a load of other tasks as well, where they make you basically. They already know the outcome. They know what you're going to do. Only one in a few people, only really bloody stubborn people, like I say, don't do it. They know what you're going to do. They know your actions, and they can chart it before you do it. And they control you by utilising, like you just said, vulnerabilities. You
see, what you're describing there actually is a very modern and sophisticated version of what we're talking about here.
Yeah.
Because I really wish it was as simple as just whispering in someone's ear. And I really wish it was like as simple as picking out that vulnerability on a piece of paper and then whispering it in your ear.
Yeah, and that's one of many contact points.
One
of many contact points, but
that's very sophisticated. It is a very sophisticated version of mind control. Absolutely. But unfortunately,
oh no, why?
it really wasn't whispers in people's ears, and the vulnerability wasn't what I want out of the world. It wasn't looking at your desires at all. In fact, if anything, it was using your desires against you in some cases, and also your vulnerabilities being certain pathologies or certain problems that you might be seeking help for. So. Just to give someone an idea, like when you think of a CIA mind control program and you think of all these things, you imagine some facility somewhere. Like, you think of aliens and you think of Roswell.
Yeah, like an Area 51 type thing.
Area plate, like one place. But it just absolutely is not that way. MK Ultra was taking place in universities, in hospitals, in prisons, all over the shop. It wasn't a centralized building where all this stuff was going on.
Okay.
It was all over the shop. And it went on for basically ages and ages, all through the Cold War. Through the Cold War, this is going on. Absolutely. But just to give you a little brief example, I'm just going to focus on one particular doctor who unfortunately was a Scot to begin with.
Oh no!
Very unfortunately, he was a Scot. He was a Scot who moved to America and subsequently to Canada, and it was in Canada. I'd never thought I'd say that a Scottish person working in Canada would be capable of this kind of stuff.
Well, it must be a mistake. It must be a mistake.
It absolutely has to be, but like testimonials would say otherwise. He was a guy called Dr. Ewan Cameron, and he was very interested in the phenomena of mind control from an intellectual point of view.
Of course.
And
Not from an emotional or caring point of view.
Well, this is it. And a lot of things was like he would often say, and like people who were close to him would say that like he didn't know he was taking money off the CIA. It was all like he didn't know about this. It was all like nonsense, or he had no knowledge of it. But the fact of the matter is that he knew about this stuff, and he would have gone ahead without CIA backing anyway. It shows that the CIA were really interested in it because we can create super spies who can go over and like do all this kind of stuff. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
It's like, and a number of people would come out in support of him saying like he didn't know, blah blah blah. But other people were like, yeah, absolutely. Of course he knew he was working for CIA. Of course he knew he was taking money from the CIA to do this kind of stuff. Now, the kind of stuff he was doing. These are testimonials from actual people, and actually these came from an episode. Have you ever heard of 60 Minutes? The famous American program, 60 Minutes?
Yes.
Yeah. Well, these are testimonials.
Isn't that like our version? That's the US version of like Panorama, isn't it?
Yeah, I'd say, yeah, it is the US version of Panorama, but it's better than Panorama. Like Panorama.
Better than Panorama?
Well, I would say that Panorama is actually pretty weak, because when you're talking about 60 Minutes, you're talking about, what's his name? Murrow. He's called F.W. Murrow or something. No, I can't remember his exact initials, but he's called Murrow. Edward Murrow, I think was his name. And the great thing about 60 Minutes was they are real exposés. Like they are people who the guy's interview. I remember there's a brilliant movie about it, about the Philip Morris thing, about how cigarettes actually are cancerous. And they interview a guy. There's a whole movie about it called The Insider. But that's the kind of thing that 60 Minutes did.
Yeah.
You know, they exposed, they found whistleblowers, and they had them talk like about it, about anything that was going on, like whether it was, you know, cigarettes or whatever. But it was very, very popular in America, far deeper than Panorama. Panorama's just like, what's wrong with our supermarkets, etc. You know?
Yeah.
This is like,
yeah, it is.
You know, like 60 Minutes was it developed a reputation for being really cutting. We're going to get somebody on, and we're going to cut the fat, and we're going to get down to what it is. Like, you know, 60 Minutes would like travel to the Middle East and accuse people of being terrorists. They'd just ask you, are you a terrorist? Wow. Like in like the late 80s in the middle of Iran. You know what I mean? They'd be like, you know, they were serious guys. But according to some testimonials from one episode of 60 Minutes that they did, so all of Dr. Ewan Cameron's work, this was his name. You might have heard about it, this place. It was called the Allen Memorial Institute at McGill University in Canada. You might have heard of that establishment, right? Well, this is where a lot of this stuff went on. These mind control experiments went on. So here's one person. So basically, there was a person called Sal Orlico, and she had depression. So she was referred to go and see Dr. Cameron for her depression, and he treated her with LSD for her depression.
I mean, interestingly, there are recently findings that can be quite useful.
Right, but he blitzed her with LSD.
Okay,
absolutely.
Not so much.
Absolutely blitzed her with LSD to the point where her brain shut down.
Wow.
And what she had to do was, after she came out the back of it, she had to help her husband had to help her find other people who'd been through the same kind of thing. And what they found was nuts. It wasn't just people like her who'd been treated with LSD. They found examples of electroshock, sleep therapy for up to 60 days. People were so drugged up, they'd sleep most of the day. And then this other idea of psychic driving. You ever heard of psychic driving?
No.
So what they do is they drug you up with either LSD. They also give you sleep drugs while you are on the LSD. And then they...
Sleep drugs while on LSD?
Yeah. So you'd be sleeping, say you're sleeping 20 hours of the day.
They've got to be the best dreams.
Okay. So you're being forced to sleep for 20 hours of the day for 60 days. 60 days. You're asleep.
60 days.
Force you to sleep for 60
but
days.
Are you awake for 4 hours? Not that that's any better, but are you awake for 4 hours then?
Yeah.
Every day?
Right, but the time that you're awake, they're doing this psychic driving. And what they're doing while you're awake and while you're under the influence of LSD while you're awake is they are pumping you with a recording, the same recording, 500,000 times.
What?
Into your brain. Pumping you. Psychic driving.
It must be a short recording for 500,000 times.
They are just pumping you with this same recording. They're locking you in a room on acid with sleep.
What sort of recordings are we talking
Just-
about here?
but
We're just
just-
talking about like voices or videos?
Like strong things. Dun, dun, dun,
Like
dun,
videos?
Dun, dun. Sounds.
Sounds.
Just yeah, psychic driving sounds, all that kind of stuff. But that's so this is one. So one woman. So this is Al Orlico was treated for depression with LSD. That is just an example. So there was another guy called Robert Logie who had leg pain, right?
Seems like such a minor thing, and I know it's going to go somewhere horrific.
Right. But he had leg pain, and this leg pain caused him emotional distress. Right.
As it might.
He got the works.
No.
Electroshock therapy. He got LSD therapy. He got sleep therapy. He got psychic driving.
Did he get aspirin?
While he was on drugs?
Oh my god.
This was what was going on under this guy, under Dr. Ewan Cameron.
Wow.
So basically, there was a doctor. Her name was Mary Morrow. I don't know if she's still alive. I imagine she is still alive. But her name was Dr. Mary Morrow, and she was interested in Cameron's work previously, his psychiatric work. Okay. And she went for a fellowship with Cameron, so she applied for a fellowship. And unfortunately for her, she made it clear to him, or she let him know, that previously to her application, she suffered with a little bit of depression.
Oh no, she didn't. Oh no.
She'd have a little bit of depression. And Cameron...
A little bit.
Cameron was... He basically said, yeah, I'll let you come and do your fellowship. But I'll only really consider you to do it if you do some sleep therapy, right? Because,
sleep therapy,
you've
okay.
depression. Let's get into this. So she was expecting, just, a couple of meds, maybe a bit of sleep.
Yeah.
All this kind of stuff.
That's what I'm expecting.
Yeah, a bit like some rest with some sedatives. You know what I mean? Just a bit of, sleep with some sedatives.
Where is this taken then?
Absolutely. What she got was electroshock therapy and a very severe amount of de-patterning. In her own words, she says he used 67 times the average dose of electric current by pushing the button of the electroshock machine 7 times in succession rather than 1. And besides that, instead of getting it 2 or 3 times a week, one press of a button like most physicians do, he gave it in daily successions. He was giving it to her every day.
So, how was she afterwards?
Oh, her mother had to come and get her out of the place.
But was she in prime physical
She
and mental
was.
health afterwards, or?
She says, I was suspended in space, in a deep black hole. I had no idea that I was a human being. I was without knowledge of my appendages. I had no sense of solidity. I was floating. I was completely disorientated. I thought I was an organism. And she was left with permanent brain damage.
So not the image of mental health that one would envisage then?
No, yeah, she was absolutely left with permanent brain damage. And this went on from...
Oh, that was permanent? That was permanent?
She was left with permanent brain damage, yeah. She has permanent brain damage now.
I'm not surprised.
She was a doctor who went to try and get a fellowship with a doctor to learn about psychiatry.
And now she's not...
She let on that she had some depression, and she got shocked the shit out of until she had permanent brain damage.
Wow.
And all this under the guise of creating spies.
Wow.
Spies, or just playing around with the idea that we can get rid of schizophrenia, we can deprogram everything, but not even that. It's just, it goes so far. You're so drugged up. Then it's just like, what are you even testing for?
It's interesting that everything we've spoken about over these 2 episodes can be linked back to the military. Everything.
Oh,
so
yes.
The first episode is fairly obvious. You've got the Nazis looking at how to stay alive when people are parachuting from altitude.
You've got the Japanese wanting to become the predominant military warfare for biological weapons in the world, becoming strong imperialism.
You've got the Russians.
The Russians.
And actually everything we've spoken about just now, the syphilis stuff, that was because divisions, or the equivalent of 2 divisions worth of personnel were dying from syphilis.
And absolutely. And this is the Cold War. So there's no hot war. It's not like, you're playing with firepower here. It's like, how can we destabilize through a human agent? So can we take a person...
Well, that's the MK Ultra, yes.
Remove their mind altogether, put in our mind, and then send them off somewhere.
So everything we've spoken about has been linked back to the military.
Yeah.
It's interesting, isn't it?
Well, the thing is, it's not that... Yeah, absolutely, we can link it back to the military, but every single country has a military, right?
yeah,
there are
yeah.
people in charge of a military. So if you just take a battalion of soldiers, right, that's not going to occur to them because all they're trained to do is go into conflicts,
Yeah.
right? That's what they're trained to do. You're talking about puppet masters here. These are puppet masters. It's like, yes, absolutely, they're military projects because they have to be military projects, because if they're not, how are you going to convince somebody to agree unless it's might, unless it's you taking someone, bringing in a bunch of subjects and subjecting them to something. And then also, as we've seen before in Japan, you don't just get military consent. You need to get them on side somehow. Even Shiro Ishii knew that he had to convince the military somehow to convince them to bring them stuff. So he gave them water purification. He gave them loads of means of staying alive. And he got a lot of support. So it's through these other ways of saving lives that you get support. And then these just lunatics who just want to go about their business just absolutely can. But I don't think your average general... right?
No,
who
so
is
that-
just
no,
trained in
definitely
warfare and wants to go across a line and go like, okay, guys, let's go and shoot up some enemy. They're not thinking, shall we inject gonorrhea into someone's eyeballs? You know what I'm saying? Yeah.
So that's not my point. I mean,
Just-
actually, you know, my perspective is if
Sorry.
the state has anything that it should be doing, it should be defense of the realm.
Right.
So actually, you know,
Fair,
it's
fair.
not that I'm anti-military. I'm just saying it's interesting that the
Oh, no,
military
yeah, no.
is where it has taken place, and actually, it's the institution of the military, and like you say, the higher ups. It's those institutions that enable those psychopaths, really, and those sociopaths to do what they do. I mean, because we can even take it back to the Nazis and say, well, I mean, Himmler actually put put Russia to death.
Yeah.
Because he was committing scientific fraud and he was abducting kids. Within these military structures, there is some level of ethic, but once you're giving some resources, once, for example, Russia was given resources, they could use it to their own ends. So it's almost like you say, you take some, you give and you take, but really it's very difficult behind closed doors to see what's really going on.
That's it.
Because, like you say, Shiro Ishii was helping the military. Russia was helping the military. He was also abducting children. And even Himmler, the head of the SS, put him to death for that. Much of the time.
But even in Russia,
Yes.
even Ivanov was sent to a Kazakhstani camp by his own supporters. You know what I mean? So,
Yeah.
It's just...
It just creates an environment where, you're helping, but once you go away and you go to a facility, or, I mean, MK Ultra's a bit different because it's decentralized, but even that's hard to track, right? Once you take that funding...
Not even all those files are declassified. So
Well,
I
no.
found a website with a whole bunch of declassified CIA, MK Ultra documents. That's where I found out about Artichoke and the various different things. But not even all of those are declassified, because there's just absolutely some horrific stuff that went on to people. Like, these are people who just wanted help for various disorders, sent to some doctor in Canada, and he just went about it.
Yeah, I mean...
And he was publishing. If you go and look at the literature, this guy, if you go and search on Google Scholar or wherever for Dr. Ewan Cameron in the 1950s, you will find his published research that he did on these people. It just wasn't clear how he was doing it.
Yeah.
But he published about the effects of sleep therapy on people. He published about the effects of electroshock, and consistently, every single time, they would never get rid of schizophrenia. They'd pulverize these people with electroshock for ages. Like Dr. Morrow, they were absolutely pulverized, and then it would take months to recover. Absolutely months to recover. But I think, if I remember correctly, there was one group of people. Say he did it on 20 people. Let's just say he did it on 20 people, right?
Okay.
3 people would stay not schizophrenic, and the rest would become schizophrenic again after months and months and months.
Okay.
It wasn't de-patterning, it wasn't deprogramming anybody, it wasn't doing anything. He just wanted to fry people. That's what he wanted to do, because all of the evidence coming back is saying that it's not working.
Yeah.
It's absolutely not working.
Well, you start from a premise and you work backwards to prove it.
This is it. He was starting with this idea that, right, like Koreans, could we... it's like Stockholm Syndrome. It's basically what Stockholm Syndrome is. And he got, there is a paper that I found, as we go further into the 1970s, there was what she was called Patty Hearst, was a celebrity who was kidnapped by a cult.
Okay.
And when they eventually found her, they got her out, but she was still espousing cultish stuff. And it took her months to
that happens to a
deprogram.
few. That happens to quite
Absolutely.
a lot of cult members.
That happens all the time.
Yeah.
So this is what fueled this guy, not that particular case, but this idea that you could indeed just influence somebody's brain patterns, influence the way someone thinks. Can you create agents, controlled subjects that just have no control over what they're going to do? You just tell them what they're going to do, and they'll do it regardless of whether or not they're going to die or not, or whether any physical pain is going to happen to them, or anything.
That's horrific. That could be me or you.
And
That could be any of us.
This was happening. This is not some prison. This is not happening somewhere random out in the middle. This is McGill University in Canada. That is still one of Canada's leading universities.
Yeah.
These are normal establishments. So this isn't hidden. This isn't being...
It's not Area 52
Absolutely
or
not.
something.
It's... Yeah, the CIA have all these classified files and all this kind of stuff that they're not releasing, but presumably all you have to do is go to McGill University and have a look what they were up to at that university. Unless it was classified by the CIA, but it's all happening there. But there's people still alive who are still doing that, who work there.
And it makes you wonder now what's happening in the present day. What's happening right now? Maybe still MK Ultra, who knows? But what's happening today? We always talk as well, of course, about China. What's happening in China? You know, the recent thing is what sort of genetic experiments are taking place in China? Because a few things have been exposed in China, a few genetic experiments. What's happening in China? What's happening here? What's happening in the US?
It brings us firmly into the realm of conspiracy, you know what I mean?
Firmly.
Absolutely into the realm of conspiracy.
Yeah.
And so if all you have to do, you can understand why some conspiracy theorists think the way they do.
Mm-hmm.
Because all you have to do is look at history and you see it, absolutely. This is not
I've been reading.
It's not made up.
I've been reading CIA declassified files on Mengele. For example, it was always a conspiracy that the Nazis fled to South America. Well, they did. So there are declassified CIA files. Mengele went to Argentina, then Paraguay, and then he was in Brazil, and he died of a stroke when he was swimming. And through DNA evidence, we've actually managed to dig up his body, and his skull is now in a Brazilian university being used by forensic students. Thankfully,
This is it. It's like,
but that was a conspiracy at the time. That was a conspiracy, and now the CIA files have been declassified. So, what conspiracies today around this particular topic will be declassified in 20,
tomorrow.
30 years?
Yeah, exactly.
What are we doing right now that we will find out about in 20, 30, 40 years, that we will look back on and say, oh my God, I can't believe, it's very easy for us and for any listeners of this podcast to look back and go, wow, giving people syphilis, or wow, giving people hypothermia, or, putting them in these pressure chambers, dropping plague bombs on people. I mean, these are
grinded up mites and injecting them into thighs, vivisections.
These are obviously bad. And if we knew about it today, I'm sure me or you, the layperson like us, would say that's bad. But what are we doing now that is bad that we don't know about?
Well, when we make Facebook, Twitter, and all these social media platforms actually release all of their data that they are being collected and that they're keeping from educational establishments because of some kind of corporate secret, we'll understand what they've been doing to us. I think that's the next step. The next step is finding out what Facebook, Twitter, how they're manipulating us, how they're
MK
playing.
Ultra of today.
That is the MK Ultra. It's the units, it's these devices in your pocket. It's how can we influence how you think, how can we influence how you maneuver within society, how can we influence how you vote, how can we influence your opinions against people who you think are different from you, how can we do that, and how can we take over control of that. That is the next MK Ultra, and I think that is happening right now. Thanks for listening to Abstracts. Music as always was Coffee by Cambo. You can find that on the Free Music Archive, link is in the description. For references used in the episode and for all references used in all episodes, head on over to abstractspodcast.com. That's abstractspodcast.com. Send us a message, say hello, and until next time, in a bit.